High up, on a windswept plateau in the upper Baetis Valley, Roman standards fluttered and snapped in the spring breeze. From this height, the land rolled away in every direction. To the north and west, a sea of olive green hills stretching toward the town of Baecula, and to the south and east, a broad river plain crisscrossed by the winding tributaries of what we now call the Guadalquivir River. 10 days earlier, this had been Hasdrubal Barca's stronghold, perched above the plains of southern Hispania, guarded by steep terraces that seemed impossible to assault. Now, it was in Roman hands. Scipio had since remade the captured camp into a Roman fortress visible for miles. And today, in mid-May 208 BC, Iberian chieftains from all around the region climbed the slope to meet him, called by his summons to hear what the Roman general was offering. Atop the plateau, before the fortified camp, the legions stood in perfect stillness, shields and armor gleaming, an intimidating sight to behold. Scipio waited among them, composed, the calm center of the storm that had swept the Carthaginian army from this height. One by one, the tribal leaders stepped forward, laying gifts before him. Beautiful silver vessels, livestock including sheep, cattle, and fine Iberian horses. Scipio received each with measured dignity, and at last addressed the assembly once all had gathered. He had not come to them as a conqueror, he said, but as a liberator, to drive out the Punic tyrants who had stolen their sons for its wars and their wealth for its greed. If they united under him, Iberia could again be free, each tribe governing its own lands so long as they stood together in common cause. His words rolled across the crowd. Murmurs rose like a tide. The recent victory at the Battle of Baecula was undeniable proof of Roman power, routing the Carthaginians from what seemed an impossible angle, led by a man said to be favored by the gods. Suddenly, one voice among the Iberians cried out, then another, until the shout became a roar. King, king, king. Scipio let the moment hold, perhaps even savoring it for a brief second, but then raised a hand until silence fell and said, Rome was a republic, one that had cast out her kings long ago. The only title he would accept was the one his soldiers had bestowed upon him, Imperator. If they sought a leader, they would find in him not a monarch hungry for a crown, but a general leading a coalition. Let them join Rome as allies, and together purge Hispania of Carthage forever. Scipio's words once again gave way to shouts of approval, as swords and spears were struck against shields, adding to the clamor. Scipio allowed himself a single faint smile. Baecula had been a great victory, but it was really here, amid the cheers of his new allies, that the complete dismantling of Carthage's empire in Spain would be realized. And yet, word of this moment would soon travel across the sea to Italy and the Senate in Rome, where anything resembling a king was despised, adding to the whispers that their ambitious commander in Spain was becoming too adored, too powerful. A legend in the making. Brilliant, unstoppable, and already casting a long shadow. Welcome to the Warlords of History podcast. I'm your host, Mark Pimenta. And in this episode, part 12 of our series on Scipio Africanus, we'll follow Scipio through the spring of 208 BC as he marches deep into the interior of southern Spain to fight his first great pitched battle against Hasdrubal Barca at the Battle of Baecula, tracing the events leading up to the clash, how Scipio, appearing to play straight into Hasdrubal's trap, instead executed a stunning advance, catching his opponent off guard and forcing him to withdraw to an exceptionally strong defensive position atop a plateau. Where we'll then, in detail, turn to the battle itself, with Hasdrubal holding ground that appeared nearly unassailable, Scipio devising a bold and unconventional assault, using deception, exhaustive preparation, and daring flanking maneuvers to overwhelm the Carthaginian position. In a stunning victory that shattered Hasdrubal's army and broke Carthage's hold over the upper Baetis valley, the consequences of which were immediate and far-reaching: the complete severing of Punic access to the vital silver mines near Castulo, the collapse of Carthaginian influence across much of south-central Spain, and a surge of Iberian allies rallying to Scipio, even hailing him as a king. Meanwhile, Hasdrubal and the other 2 Carthaginian commanders gathered north of Baecula, scrambling to salvage what remained of their position, not only in Hispania, but in Italy as well, where Hannibal was desperate for reinforcements. Devising a plan that would soon force Scipio into a defining dilemma: pursue Hasdrubal northward as he began his trek toward Italy, or remain in Hispania to consolidate the sweeping gains achieved with his incredible victory at Baecula. However, before we get into all of this, it's time for some important shoutouts, because I have the distinct honor of welcoming Christine Fowler and William B. into the ranks of the Warlords of History Immortals. Thank you for supporting my work, and to all the existing Immortals, my sincere gratitude for your continued support. For anyone else interested in joining them, you can find the show's Patreon and PayPal links in the support section of the Warlords of History website. Alright, here we go. And as always, let's quickly revisit where we left everything off in the last episode. In early 209 BC, with Scipio having rudely awakened the Carthaginians to the new threat rising against them in Hispania. After an astonishing 10-day march down the eastern coast, launching a fierce and unexpected assault on the greatest Punic stronghold in Spain, Carthago Nova, storming it in a single day through a breathtaking mix of speed, deception, and sheer brutality. In the aftermath, showing surprising clemency, in particular, freeing the Iberian hostages and restoring them to their tribes, gestures that won him deep gratitude among many Iberian peoples. Also, by securing Carthago Nova, Scipio gained more than just that one city. It became a permanent Roman stronghold, through which he was able to wrestle down control of almost the entire eastern seaboard of Iberia, from Carthago Nova up through Tarraco and Emporiae. Yet, despite this extraordinary victory, the Senate sent him little support. So Scipio used resourcefulness to increase his military strength, embarking on a charm offensive among the Iberian tribes, winning allies through diplomacy and charisma, securing 5,000 new Iberian troops. At the same time, drawing men from his naval fleet, retraining sailors into infantry, and spending the winter of 209 to 208 BC drilling his army into a cohesive, highly trained force. This in anticipation of what was now awaiting them, being that, through the winter into the early spring of 208 BC, Hasdrubal Barca had begun striking back, by viciously raiding Scipio's newly won allies along the eastern seaboard, daring the Roman commander to respond, to march south into the interior, and face him in open battle. Bringing us back to where we left everything off in the last episode, in mid-March 208 BC, with Scipio, in response to Hasdrubal Barca's taunting challenges, leading his 35,000-strong army out of winter quarters at Tarraco, modern Tarragona, in the long march southwest toward the Carthaginian mining town of Castulo, in what is today the region of Andalusia in southern Spain, where Hasdrubal had based his main army. in the lead up to an impending battle that Scipio wanted just as much as Hasdrubal, knowing that victory here would greatly build upon his stunning success at Carthago Nova, sending a clear message across Iberia that Rome could do far more than seize cities. It could smash Carthaginian armies in open combat, deep within their own heartland, thereby cementing Rome's rising military and political dominance in the peninsula. Scipio marched with a tight circle of young but capable lieutenants. As always, Gaius Laelius at his side, his trusted right hand, the talented officer Marcus Silanus, and another Scipio, the general's younger brother Lucius, now 20 years old, who by now had likely graduated from staff duties to more of a middle command, perhaps a military tribune leading larger and larger contingents, up to half a legion at this point. Together, it was this youthful command group, much younger than would have been found in any other Roman army of the time, that now prepared to test themselves against one of Carthage's most accomplished veteran generals, Hasdrubal Barca, the eldest of Hannibal's two younger brothers. From Tarraco, Scipio's 35,000 troops, 30,000 Roman and Italian allies, recently reinforced by 5,000 Iberian troops, they all marched south, roughly 240 kilometers to Saguntum, before adjusting their route southwest, 450 kilometers inland to Castulo, deep in south-central Spain. A journey of nearly 700 kilometers that would be completed over the next 5 to 6 weeks, leaving behind only small defending forces in the low thousands protecting northeastern Hispania. A calculated risk, being that Scipio's intelligence network was in full operation, providing a steady stream of intel on exactly where the enemy's three armies stood. Mago Barca at the Carthaginian city Gadez, near the southernmost coast of Spain, Hasdrubal Gisgo in western Iberia, and of course, Hasdrubal Barca entrenched at Castulo. The Roman commander also acutely aware of the 5,000-strong Carthaginian raiding detachment led by the Numidian prince Massinissa, that even as Scipio's army marched, were striking at Rome's newly won Iberian allies along the eastern coast, including sniffing around Carthago Nova. However, with Scipio knowing that chasing down these raiders would only sap his momentum, wasting precious time on lengthy and potentially futile pursuits, so instead he kept his focus on the source of the problem, driving straight into the heart of Carthaginian Spain, toward Hasdrubal's main army at Castulo, on the upper reaches of the Baetis River. The place where, as you may recall from the close of the last episode, in late 209 BC, Hasdrubal had moved his 33,000-strong army to, for three primary reasons. First, to secure Carthage's vital access to the nearby silver mines. Second, to hold the central interior against Roman advances, while simultaneously launching ruinous raids eastward. Leading up to the third reason, to bait Scipio into a trap. Because, while Hasdrubal stayed put with the vast bulk of his army at Castulo, this is when and from where he detached Massinissa with around 5,000 Numidian and Carthaginian cavalry to sweep across eastern Hispania, punishing the tribes that had recently sided with Rome, striking around Carthago Nova as well. All of this in the effort to reverse the severe political harm associated with the loss of Carthago Nova in the year prior, and, as Livy puts it in his work From the Founding of the City, with Hasdrubal seeing the first flow of Iberians go over to Scipio, unless he ventured to do something, realizing that more would melt away to the Roman side as they had begun to do. This drove the Punic commander to pressure a major clash as soon as possible. And what's more, one fought on his terms and on grounds of his choosing, giving way to a plan that was bold, but you might recognize as familiar. Beyond punishing the new Roman allies, the raids also being used to pressure a reaction from Scipio, luring him deep inland, where the attacks were being staged from, which Patrick Hunt in his book Hannibal details happened to be under similar circumstances and in the same very river plain where Scipio's father and his army were defeated 2.5 years before. Like then, once it was clear that Scipio committed to the march, Hasdrubal intended to recall Massinissa and summon both Mago Barca and Hasdrubal Gisco to converge, surrounding the Romans and crushing them in a single decisive blow. After all, the strategy had worked before. There was every reason to think it could work again. Granted, there were some drawbacks. Detaching Massinissa's cavalry reduced Hasdrubal's field army to about 28,000 men. Moreover, with only a small cavalry contingent remaining, critically, this would weaken his reconnaissance abilities, something that would come back to haunt him. And to make matters worse, Hasdrubal also responded to the growing political crisis by tightening his grip on his Iberian allies, demanding more money, hostages, and harsher guarantees of loyalty. However, as Howard Scullard notes in his book, Scipio Africanus, Soldier and Politician, these oppressive measures simply pushed more Iberian tribes to defect. And where did they go? I'm sure you can guess. According to Livy, it was at this point that the two co-chieftains, the brothers Indibilis and Mandonius, they abandoned the Carthaginian cause, taking with them the full strength of their clans. And while we don't know precisely when or where the meeting took place, it seems to have occurred sometime early on into Scipio's march south, that the two chieftains approached the Roman camp, offering an alliance, and with it, some 5,000 additional Iberian troops. Which, on the surface, clearly a huge win for Scipio. Yet beneath it, the echo of a previous, very personal betrayal. Definitely an intriguing subplot to uncover here. Because, as you may remember from Part 9, when Scipio's father and uncle were killed at the Battle of the Upper Baetis in 211 BC, much of this had to do with the betrayal of their Iberian allies, bribed by Hasdrubal Barca to abandon the Romans on the eve of battle. Inferred from both Polybius and Livy, it appears that Indibilis and Mandonius were among those defectors, brothers who co-led a subgroup of the Elargeti tribe. Interestingly, many of their people had already rallied to Scipio's side over the past year, but the brothers had stayed away, perhaps fearing Roman retribution. You see, Iberian tribes were seldom unified. Alliances shifted with circumstances, and leaders of clans followed their own whims. But by early 208 BC, the harsher Carthaginian demands for money, hostages, and manpower had grown unbearable. And when combined with Scipio's diplomatic tone and approach, the brothers finally decided to take the risk. Because what Scipio was offering was simply too good to pass up. Not seeking subjugation of the Iberians, but more so partnerships. Better said as a coalition, united under Rome's leadership to eradicate the Punic presence in Hispania. The tribes would fight alongside Rome to drive Carthage out, and in return, Scipio promised to restore their sovereignty. Further evidenced by Polybius in his work The Histories, when he writes, Scipio secured the confidence and friendship of the Iberians by making them see that Rome's intervention was more akin to a movement with Scipio at its head. Nonetheless, we can imagine the thick tension as Indibilis and Mandonius rode into the Roman camp with a small escort. Scipio stood before them, knowing exactly who they were, men whose past choices had helped doom his family. Polybius goes on to recount their plea. They claimed coercion, and justified their former actions and friendship with the Carthaginians on the basis of deception. They had been forced to obey under the threat of death to their kin and people. The Carthaginians had held their relatives hostage and deceived them repeatedly with false promises. So they came now to give their loyalty to Rome, provided Scipio would hold true to his word and honor. Some of his surrounding officers likely urged punishment, perhaps even execution. But Scipio, ever the strategist, saw beyond vengeance. Iberia wouldn't be won by the sword alone. It required diplomacy, alliances, and the projection of Roman justice. And he understood that each tribe that joined him strengthened not just his army, but the legitimacy of the broader coalition he was building. So Scipio ultimately accepted their explanation, granted them clemency, and welcomed them and their warriors. It was both magnanimous and politically shrewd, securing their gratitude, at least for now. Because we need to add a huge asterisk here. This subplot with Indibulus and Mandonius is far from finished, and will resurface to dramatic consequences in a future episode. For now, however, their defection added 5,000 fresh Iberian troops to Scipio's ranks, swelling his army to 40,000 as they continued the march toward Castulo and toward Hasdrubal Barca. Naturally, not everyone in Scipio's camp welcomed their new Iberian comrades with open arms. And while Scipio never allowed doubt to show, he too must have been extremely wary. Iberian loyalty was famously fluid. They would stand with Rome so long as Rome appeared strong. But if fortune shifted, their allegiance might shift with it. So how did he manage them? Part of the answer lay in Scipio's keen understanding of human psychology, his ability to read motives, win trust, and project magnetic confidence. But Scipio was no idealist. The memory of his father's and uncle's deaths lingered as a stark reminder that such alliances could crumble in a heartbeat to ruinous consequences. Thus, even as he embraced these new allies, he quietly took precautions. Although the sources don't say it outright, given what we know of the huge importance Scipio placed on intelligence, rarely caught off guard in any campaign, be it from external foes or from within, it's very likely that Scipio fostered and maintained a discreet network of informants among the Iberian contingents, keeping him aware of shifting moods or simmering grievances. However, on a more practical, military level, he also structured his army to minimize risk. Iberian units were integrated into his army, yes, but never placed in positions where their sudden defection could break a Roman line. Key tactical roles remained in the hands of his Roman and Italian troops, whose loyalty was beyond question. Meanwhile, Scipio drew heavily on his Iberian allies' strengths. Their deep familiarity with the terrain, the ravines, hidden tracks, and winding valleys of southern Hispania provided an invaluable edge. And as Scipio's army pushed inland toward Hasdrubal Barca's camp in the upper Baetis Valley, especially after passing through Saguntum, this local knowledge proved essential, allowing his army to advance with remarkable secrecy, effectively disappearing into the landscape, moving through the interior in a way that would soon catch Hasdrubal entirely off guard. Because I'm convinced that Scipio saw straight through the trap that Hasdrubal had laid out for him, given, according to Livy, Scipio's motivation and the measures he took to fight with one general and army before the armies of the enemy should unite. Even with the new Iberian allies who had joined him, bolstering his count to 40,000, outnumbering Hasdrubal's 28,000 that awaited them at Castulo by a considerable degree, Scipio recognized the danger, in that, if Mago from Gades, Hasdrubal Gisgo from the west, or even Massinisa's 5,000 raiders were alerted in time, it was the Romans who could be caught hopelessly outnumbered. Yet, within that danger, lay an opportunity. If he could reach Hasdrubal first, and do so quietly, he could smash one Carthaginian army before the others could come to their aid. This became the logic behind another of Scipio's incredible maneuvers during the Spanish campaign. A march not defined by speed, but cloaked in secrecy. Pushing southwest from Saguntum toward Castulo, Scipio's forces advanced with almost unnatural silence. Roman and Iberian cavalry would have screened the army, clearing routes ahead and ensuring no messenger escaped to warn the Carthaginians. Unlike his blistering charge on Carthago Nova the year before, here Scipio prioritized concealment, avoiding the main roads, threading his columns through wooded valleys, narrow hill tracks, and winding paths hidden from the wider plains. Here, his Iberian allies would have been invaluable, guiding him along routes known only to locals, enabling an army of 40,000 to move like a shadow across the interior. Every day of secrecy, every kilometer gained before Hasdrubal caught wind of his approach, increased Scipio's chances of confronting the Punic force alone, all in the effort to invert Hasdrubal's trap, to make the hunter the hunted. And by late April 208 BC, as Scipio's army closed in on Castulo, where Hasdrubal's forces were still encamped, while it soon became clear that the first part of the Carthaginian plan had worked, the Romans had indeed been drawn deep into the interior, just as Hasdrubal had intended. What's also clear is that his strategy carried a serious self-inflicted flaw. By detaching Massinissa and those 5,000 horsemen who remained far off in the east, harassing Scipio's new Iberian allies, Hasdrubal was left half blind, robbing himself of the very scouts that could have been used to give him advance warning of Scipio's arrival. Because when word finally reached the Carthaginian general that the Roman army was approaching, it came with less than a week's warning. What he thought a distant threat nearly at his doorstep. The shock must have been profound, accentuated by his 28,000 men being heavily outnumbered by Scipio's 40,000, including a huge disparity in cavalry, which forced Hasdrubal to react swiftly, immediately doing two things. First, sending riders racing urgently out in all directions, south to Mago at Gades, west to Hasdrubal Gisgo, and east to Massinissa, demanding they come to him with all possible speed. And second, Polybius tells us, on hearing of the impending arrival of the Romans, unwilling to risk battle on open ground, he ordered his army to move, abandoning Castulo, moving his army about 15 kilometers west, where the terrain rose sharply into a series of ridges and terraces overlooking the upper Baetis river valley, just south of what is today the town of Belen, Spain, but at the time known as Baecula, the town that would give this upcoming battle its name. Now, when Hasdrubal shifted his camp, I have to say he chose his new ground masterfully. As mentioned, a rugged, hilly landscape where sharp ridges rose abruptly from the surrounding plain. However, among these ridges jutting out a formidable plateau, one that you can picture almost like two enormous steps rising from the river valley to the high ground above. Perhaps best described by Basil Hart in his book, Scipio Africanus, Greater Than Napoleon, when he writes, "It was an exceptionally strong defensive position. The plateau itself formed by two natural terraces, or steps, rising one above the other. The lower terrace sloped up from the shallow river that ran across the plain, while the upper level, broader and higher, held Hasdrubal's fortified camp. Behind it rose broken upland ground, blocking any attack from the rear. On both sides of the plateau, steep wooded ravines that made flanking movements nearly impossible. It was, in essence, a natural fortress, naturally defensible from every angle but the front, and even there, the Romans would have to cross a shallow river, then fight their way uphill, storming terrace after terrace stacked with defenders. For a general outnumbered and short on cavalry, this terrain was a gift. It narrowed the Roman numerical advantage, played to Carthaginian strengths, and offered Hasdrubal as close to an impregnable position as he could have hoped for. Which, as soon as Scipio led his army into the area, approaching from the southern plain, he would have recognized this clearly, faced with a daunting sight. Hasdrubal also arranging his forces there to accentuate the geographical advantages. Let's look at this from Scipio's perspective. The Roman general facing northwards, seeing a waist-deep river, and beyond it, the land rising sharply to the first step, laden with thousands of enemy light infantry, before the land rose higher still to the upper plateau, crowned with the Carthaginian encampment, and Punic banners fluttering amid Hasdrubal's elite African heavy infantry and 15 war elephants. To the immediate left and right of the plateau, sharp and terribly steep ravines, choked with trees and shadow. Scipio, clear-eyed and pragmatic as ever, must have been both deeply impressed and unsettled. He knew time wasn't on his side. The longer he waited, the greater the risk that Mago, Hasdrubal Gisgo, or even Massinisa's cavalry would return and trap him between converging Punic forces. Yet, Polybius notes plainly, though eager to bring on battle, Scipio was somewhat at a loss as how to attack, given the advantageous and secure position of the enemy. Still, on that first day, Scipio took immediate precautions. Recognizing that the steep terraces made cavalry essentially useless in the upcoming fight, he instead deployed his horsemen to guard the battlefield's outer approaches, the places where danger would come from if Carthaginian reinforcements suddenly appeared. To the west, he stationed some of his cavalry along the main road, and to the east, the rest were used to block the narrow pass where the river plain tightened into the foothills. If Mago, Gisgo, or Massinissa arrived unexpectedly, they would find themselves delayed at these carefully chosen choke points, buying Scipio the time he might need to evacuate and avoid total disaster. And on the afternoon of the first day, as Scipio's army was still raising its camp on the plain opposite the plateau, the tension snapped. Even before his fortifications were complete, the Roman general ordered a series of limited attacks, sharp probes meant to test the Carthaginian defenses all along the base of the lower terrace. What followed was a brief but ferocious clash. Roman light infantry velites surged forward, loosing javelins and pressing up the slope, only to be met with an answering storm of missiles from Hasdrubal's light troops above. Charges and countercharges flared along the hillside, each side daring the other to commit to a full battle. Livy captures the moment, describing it as a fierce skirmish that nearly provoked each other to a full battle. However, with the ground favoring the defenders, and the Romans fighting uphill, experiencing the heaviest of the losses, this forced Scipio to call off the attack. Hasdrubal, for his part, also refused to let his troops pursue, holding them firmly on the high ground, unwilling to squander his positional advantage. And so, for the next 2 days, both armies settled into a tense standoff, the calm broken only by small, sharp, sporadic skirmishes along the lower slopes. Scipio sending out detachments of velites and Iberian light infantry to harass the Carthaginian line, only to be driven back each time. Minor clashes compared to the fierce encounter of the first day. Yet, behind these seemingly minor probes, as Basil Hart notes, Scipio's plan was quietly taking shape. Every eruption of activity at the front masked the real work underway. Scipio had dispatched men to survey every approach to the plateau, the ravines, ridges, and angled slopes that wrapped around Hasdrubal's position. Hasdrubal, meanwhile, remained supremely confident. From his vantage point, entrenched atop what he believed to be an unassailable position, there was no reason to shift an inch. In order to reach him, the Romans needed to come uphill into the teeth of his defenses, meaning that if Scipio wanted a battle, he'd have to pay dearly for it. Otherwise, the Punic general was quite content to wait. Because every hour Scipio waited brought Carthaginian reinforcements closer, and by this point, Three separate forces were indeed racing toward Baecula. In the east, Massinissa and his cavalry riding back at full speed. And from the west came not one, but two armies, Mago Barca and Hasdrubal Barca, advancing with their quickest moving units. But Scipio was no fool, whether by means of his far-reaching intelligence network or simple logic. He knew exactly what Hasdrubal was attempting. Delay meant entrapment. Hesitation meant ruin. Polybius captures the growing urgency with stark clarity. After 3 days of waiting, Scipio became apprehensive lest Mago and Gisgo should come up and he should find himself surrounded by the enemy on all sides. He therefore decided to take his chance and make an attempt on the enemy. Scipio resolved to launch an attack the following morning, one that was daring, deceptive, and utterly unconventional, a method of attack that neither the Carthaginians, nor the Romans for that matter, had ever seen. And it's here, on the eve of his first major pitched battle, that Scipio's tactical approach, equal parts innovator and master strategist, will soon come sharply into focus. The stage set for a display of brilliance that would begin to redefine Roman warfare. Which brings us to an important point before we enter the battle itself. In order to understand what made Scipio such a battlefield genius, and to grasp what he was about to attempt at Baecula, it's worth pausing to examine his thinking and his approach to tactics as a whole. Now, as we explored back in Part 10, and evident to us throughout the first years commanding in Hispania, Scipio was a meticulous architect of campaigns. Every movement he planned served a larger strategic vision, carefully prepared, precisely executed, yet flexible enough to adapt to shifting realities. That same overarching vision as a campaign strategist would soon define him as a battlefield tactician. Of course, he already had the conquest of Carthago Nova behind him, but Baecula was something else entirely. Scipio had never before commanded in a full-scale pitched battle, yet at 28, he was already a veteran of countless engagements, great and small. He had seen war in its most brutal forms, from the initial clash at Ticinus to the unbelievable slaughter at Cannae. And while he had most certainly been taught the Roman way of war, he seems to have gained the most impactful lessons through the time-proven teacher's experience and observation. He had witnessed Hannibal's maneuvers firsthand and absorbed the Carthaginians' fluid use of terrain, mobility, and deception. As Robert Garland in his book Hannibal reminds us, Scipio therefore knew Hannibal well and was studied in the tactics he and the Carthaginian commanders employed. And just as importantly, Scipio learned from Rome's own commanders, their successes, yes, but even more so their failures. This is what began to elevate Scipio to a new standard of Roman general. He took all of those lessons, from enemies, allies, mentors, and disasters, and he innovated, fusing discipline with daring, combining the order and raw punching power of Roman armies with a surprising agility and adaptability. In fact, I think one could make a very strong case that, when it came to handling heavy infantry, the backbone of Mediterranean warfare, Scipio operated on a level even beyond Hannibal. And although Scipio now commanded some 40,000 men, at the nucleus of this force was the core he had forged through relentless training. 30,000 Roman and Italian allied troops, including roughly 22,000 heavy infantry, honed into a single cohesive engine of war. Across Hispania, the Carthaginian forces still vastly outnumbered him, fielding nearly 90,000 men in total. Yet what Scipio lacked in sheer numbers, he more than compensated for in cohesion, discipline, and reliability. By early 208 BC, his army had become, if not the finest in the entire peninsula, then certainly the best trained and most versatile, and arguably the most effective Roman force anywhere in the war up to that point. Downtime was something they had rarely known since their new commander first set foot on Iberian soil, and through the past winter of 209 into the spring of 208, he drilled them in new methods and formations. Day after day, the Roman camps thundered with the rhythm of maneuvers, mock assaults, rapid deployments, coordinated strikes. Scipio trained them, not merely to fight, but to adapt, to shift formation on command, to strike with precision, to execute tactical concepts few armies in the ancient world had ever witnessed. It was this relentless dedication to preparation, this almost obsessive refinement of skill and coordination, that allowed Scipio's troops to carry out the full range of their commander's imagination on the battlefield. Which raises the obvious question: what exactly made Scipio an innovator on the battlefield? Well, I'd be remiss not to mention the improved Roman sword discussed in the last episode, the Gladius Hispaniensis, produced en masse after the capture of Carthago Nova. This weapon certainly helped his men cut through whatever stood in their way. But Scipio's real breakthroughs were tactical, reshaping how Romans fought. Traditional Roman doctrine was predictable: light troops in front, heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, a crushing frontal advance that relied on weight and endurance. Undeniably effective, yes, but rigid. And as Howard Scullard notes, prone to a major weakness, in that Rome's heavy infantry relied mainly on its devastating weight, and could not wheel about nor turn easily, making it vulnerable to outflanking. Scipio saw the flaw and set about fixing it. He infused mobility, flexibility, and deception into Rome's traditionally blunt instrument, turning the line-bound legion into something far more fluid. His deployments changed from battle to battle. Sometimes the heavy infantry led in the center, sometimes he placed them on the wings for sudden flanking blows. At other times, local auxiliaries held the center, masking the maniples that would later strike in coordinated pincers. He kept enemies guessing, shifting formations even multiple times in the days leading up to a battle, creating hesitation and confusion across the field. And unlike many Roman commanders, Scipio didn't treat his Iberian allies as expendable. He leaned into their strengths: reconnaissance, ambush, rapid maneuver, using them to complement the disciplined Roman corps. His methods fused Roman discipline with Hannibalic cunning, indirect approaches, hidden marches, feints, and abrupt changes of momentum. Unpredictability becoming one of his deadliest weapons. Proof of this, Howard Scullard goes on to highlight, is that the brilliant tactics employed by Scipio at Baecula were a complete break with traditional movements of a Roman army, and mark a real turning point in military development. And now, we're about to see all of these elements coming together in the first full expression of this new Roman way of war. In late April 208 BC, with both armies standing face to face, Hasdrubal Barca entrenched on the heights north of the waist-deep river, and Scipio to the south, below on the flatland plain. Although Scipio commanded around 40,000 men, in truth, closer to 35,000 were available for the fight, being that most of his cavalry had been sent off to guard the critical eastern and western approaches. At the core stood about 22,000 Roman and Italian heavy infantry, supported by 5,000 light troops, the velites, and roughly 8,000 Iberian medium and light infantry. Opposing them, Hasdrubal fielded approximately 28,000 men, 8,000 African and Punic heavy infantry, 4,000 light troops, including Balearic slingers, and 15,000 Iberian allies, with virtually no cavalry to speak of. He did also have 15 war elephants, but on the steep, terraced ground of Baecula, not of much use. Then, at dawn on the 4th day since the Romans had arrived, the hills around Baecula stirred to life once again. Scipio beginning quietly, as he had in the days before, from the Roman camp, ordering groups of Roman and Iberian light infantry to advance across the shallow river, forming up at the base of the plateau. Their numbers were larger than usual, perhaps a few thousand, but their actions seemed routine, hurling javelins, trading missiles, then withdrawing. Watching from the upper terrace, Hasdrubal gauged this to be yet another day of probing skirmishes. Trusting in the strength of his position, but according to Livy, seeing the larger count of Roman skirmishers in field, this, consequently, drove Hasdrubal to send more of his light troops out from his camp to reinforce the lower step. Confident the Romans would never dare attempt, much less be able to succeed, in a full assault up the slopes without their famed heavy infantry at the front. And indeed, the Roman heavy troops remained conspicuously absent, still inside their camp. From Hasdrubal's vantage point, this confirmed what he expected. If a real attack was coming, the Romans would lead with their heavy infantry, not these harassing detachments. So the pattern continued. Roman light troops charging forward, loosing volleys of javelins, then falling back to rearm and rest, replaced by fresh skirmishers, cycling in behind them. However, this was no mere repeat of the previous days. Behind the veil of scattered skirmishes, the Roman general was preparing his decisive strikes. His heavy infantry stood unseen in camp, calm, silent, but at the ready, only waiting for the signal. While, out at the base of the first step, what began as scattered probes grew steadier, faster, more intense. Like water slowly heating over a flame, each wave of Roman skirmishers arrived larger and more aggressive than the last. Polybius notes that the Romans executed Scipio's orders with great gallantry, steadily increasing the pressure on the Carthaginian light troops holding the lower terrace, causing the Punic commander to simply send more reinforcements to the ridge. Yet, unbeknownst to Hasdrubal, the reality was that his army was sitting in a cauldron, and Scipio, ever so slightly, was turning up the heat. By the time the surface began to boil, the Carthaginian general would realize only too late the dire situation his army was in. And then the rhythm broke entirely. Intensified skirmishing, suddenly swelling into a full-scale assault along the entire base of the plateau. Roman velites and Iberian light troops surged across the river and up the slope. But this time, they didn't fall back after casting their javelins. They pressed onward, scrambling over rocks and loose soil, under a hail of missiles and stones raining down from above. And according to Howard Scullard, this was the moment when Scipio dispatched the whole of his light-armed troops to carry the attack forward, an unheard-of tactic. Soon after, sending small detachments of Roman heavy infantry in support, keeping Hasdrubal's full attention locked on the furious struggle unfolding before him. The hillside erupted into chaos. Nearly 15,000 Roman and Iberian allied troops clawed upward in a storm of javelins, sling stones, and close-quarter combat. Livy describes how, although the climb was difficult, and they were nearly overwhelmed by missiles and stones, by sheer persistence they forced their way onto the first step, causing Hasdrubal to commit still more troops to the lower terrace, until somewhere in the realm of just over 30,000 men were battling it out across the lower slopes. At last, the Carthaginian commander ordered his elite African heavy infantry to begin forming up on the edge of the upper terrace, intending to hold them back as a fresh hammer to smash the Roman assault once the climbers exhausted themselves. By now, Hasdrubal must have believed that he now understood Scipio's intent. A reckless, unimaginative frontal attack straight up the center. Exactly what any traditional Roman commander would do, and precisely what his position was built to repel. The Romans were taking the heaviest casualties. The slope favored the defenders. Everything appeared to be unfolding according to his expectations. But this was the illusion Scipio wanted him to see. Because, by late morning, possibly early afternoon, as the fight on the lower slope reached its peak, shouting, dust, and the clash of metal echoing across the valley, a very different kind of attack was quietly and only just beginning. While Hasdrubal's full attention remained locked on the raging melee below, two great Roman columns began to move. Scipio and his trusted second Laelius, each leading a powerful force of some 8,000 to 10,000 heavy infantry, slipping away from their camp and disappearing into the steep, wooded ravines flanking both sides of the plateau. Now, I have to include here that historical sources differ on how this movement unfolded. Some describe the legionaries marching openly in twin columns before vanishing behind the slopes, their routes masked by the dust and uproar of the fighting. Others suggest something even subtler, small groups of heavy infantry quietly peeling off from the successive attacks throughout the morning, filtering into the ravines until two formidable Roman masses had secretly assembled on the Carthaginian flanks. However it happened, all accounts, including Basil Hart, agree on what followed. As the battle on the first slope was raging, Scipio divided his heavy foot into two bodies, he himself leading the right, disappearing into the ravine on the enemy's left, while Laelius led the left through the ravine on the enemy's right. Hidden beneath the canopy of trees, the two Roman forces began their arduous ascent, scrambling up narrow goat paths and loose rock, guided by the scouts who had mapped out the routes in the days before. Above them, Hasdrubal noticed none of it. Every Carthaginian eye remained fixed on the fierce struggle at the first terrace, completely unaware that two Roman heavy infantry pincers were climbing into position on either flank. And frankly, who could have imagined it? Roman heavy troops, the epitome of rigid, linear warfare, being deployed through ravines and broken mountainous ground. It was unprecedented, brilliant, and about to change everything. With Scipio's column reaching the summit first, bursting out of the shadowed ravine, spilling out onto the upper plateau, behind the Carthaginian lines, and just to the left of where Hasdrubal's heavy infantry were still struggling to form up. It was the perfect point of impact. The Carthaginians were caught completely unprepared. Their elite infantry were only half assembled, still shifting ranks to reinforce the fighting below when the Romans hit them. Livy conveys the shock. Scipio and his men suddenly charged into the left flank of the enemy, an assault so quick and vicious that Hasdrubal's heavy troops were immediately thrown into terrible disorder, with confused shouts resounding on every side. To Hasdrubal's credit, he reacted fast, driving officers forward, shouting orders, trying desperately to form a defensive front. But before his men could stabilize, the second hammer fell. On the opposite side, Laelius and his own column of Roman heavy infantry flooded onto the plateau. It was at that moment, Basil Hart writes, when the two Roman divisions swept up onto the terrace on both wings and fell on the flanks of the Carthaginians while they were still trying to form up. Hasdrubal understood the bitter truth. The battle was lost, choosing to evacuate his best troops, treasure, and elephants. Scipio's double envelopment was now underway, Roman heavy infantry on both sides, clamping down on their Punic adversaries like closing jaws. Hasdrubal threw his Iberian reserves forward in a desperate rearguard, buying time as he evacuated what mattered most: his African heavy infantry, elephants, and his vast silver treasury. These assets had to survive if he hoped to continue the struggle in Hispania or reinforce Hannibal in Italy. But Scipio chose not to pursue Hasdrubal. Down on the lower terrace, his Roman and Iberian troops were still locked in a brutal fight. To chase the retreating Punic commander would be to risk heavy losses among his men, losses he couldn't afford. Accordingly, Livy tells us, after clearing out the top, instead of chasing Hasdrubal and the fleeing portion of his army, Scipio commenced an attack on the Carthaginian troops now trapped and surrounded on the lower terrace, ordering Laelius to do the same, causing the Punic front line to collapse entirely. What followed was a brief but savage rout on the lower step, as Roman forces pressed downward and the Carthaginian defenders, abandoned and surrounded, broke. Roughly 6,000 Carthaginians were slain, most of them in this final collapse. Another 10,000 surrendered when Scipio halted the killing. In total, Hasdrubal lost around 16,000 men, more than half his army, while the Romans suffered only about 2,000 casualties in all. This was a staggering victory. Scipio, this untested Roman commander, in his first real battlefield encounter, from a much weaker starting point, had impressively outmaneuvered a veteran Carthaginian general and shattered his field army that had been nestled in an exceptionally strong defensive position. As Barry Strauss comments in his book, Masters of Command, despite his inexperience, Scipio proved himself a brilliant general in this decisive victory by enveloping the flanks of the Carthaginian army at the Battle of Baecula. Never before had a Roman force maneuvered so well. Scipio trained his men long and hard. The Battle of Baecula, unquestionably, was the moment Scipio arrived as a generational commander for the Roman Republic. Further evidenced by what happened next, right after the fighting stopped, as the sounds of battle faded, one truth began settling over the victorious Roman troops. They had just taken part in something extraordinary. Because, as Howard Scullard points out, there, amid the blood-soaked steppes of the plateau, upon the surrender of the last of the Carthaginian troops, as the Roman general ascended to the edge of the top level, saluting his men with his sword, the roars of triumph echoing back to him from his troops, soon transformed into a single word, chanted by his men, that echoed off the slopes, Imperator, causing Scipio to feel the electric excitement of command worship, the army celebrating not just their victory, but him specifically. Imperator, an early form of the word emperor, at that time, however, meaning something more akin to victorious commander, a rare honorific title bestowed by troops on their commander after a major victory, a practice much more common in later centuries into the late Republic. However, even then, only reserved for especially incredible victories, also requiring that the general being hailed as such had personally led them in the battle. Scullard goes on to comment, Scipio, if not the first, was among the very earliest Romans to be saluted by his troops in this way. The act was of considerable importance, marking a uniquely close personal bond between commander and men, a leader revered by those who served under him. However, as Scipio and his men settled into the abandoned Carthaginian camp that very night, already another crucial decision was weighing upon the Roman commander. Polybius records that Scipio convened a council of war, wherein some of his officers urged immediate pursuit, since Hasdrubal Barca was retreating north in chaos, with only 12,000 survivors at his back. And certainly, while the Romans could have annihilated what was left of them, Scipio ultimately decided against it, judging the pursuit as not worth the risk, a decision that would add up to become one of the most controversial of his entire military career, and one we'll examine closely in the next episode, because this would only be the first of several opportunities he had to chase Hasdrubal down, and he let every one of them pass. The Senate, as we'll see, would be furious, going so far as to call out Scipio for excessive timidity. Yet, in the immediate aftermath of Baecula, that restraint proved one of his shrewdest calculations, knowing that Hasdrubal's army wouldn't remain that small for much longer. With Livy confirming Scipio's prediction exactly right, being that, within days of the battle, just north of Baecula, Hasdrubal Barca was joined by Mago, Hasdrubal Gisgo, and the returning Massinissa, not bringing their entire armies, only their fastest moving contingents, though still, altogether, counting an estimated 50 to 60,000 men. Late to the battle, yes, but united, and what's more, outnumbering the Roman force by a wide margin. Meaning that, had Scipio pursued north with his roughly 38,000 men, he might have walked straight into the trap Hasdrubal had originally set for him, isolated, surrounded, and crushed on open ground. And yet, having avoided that pitfall, he had to consider a second danger. With all three Carthaginian armies now combined, they might choose to counterattack Scipio at Baecula itself. But here, on this steep, defensible plateau, Scipio held the advantage. So he stayed put and strengthened his fortifications, preparing for whatever came next. However, important for us to note that Scipio chose to remain at Baecula not only for military reasons, but also because there was enormous strategic and political value in doing so. And in the days following the battle, he didn't sit idle in anticipation of the Carthaginian response. Far from it. Scipio intended to squeeze every last drop of advantage from his dazzling victory. He understood that the defeat of Hasdrubal Barca was much more than a battlefield triumph. It was a propaganda treasure, a chance to pull nearby Iberian tribes deeper into Rome's orbit. As ever, Scipio's eyes were fixed on the long game, severing Carthaginian influence across the peninsula, tribe by tribe, allegiance by allegiance. And, as his next actions will show, a commander who knew exactly how to turn military success into lasting political gains. Starting with how he handled the prisoners. As mentioned earlier, roughly 10,000 enemy troops had fallen into Roman hands, about 9,000 Iberians and around 1,000 Carthaginian and African soldiers. And while, as Basil Hart notes, all the African prisoners were sold as slaves, Scipio once more showed his political acuity by sending home the Spanish prisoners without ransom, a continuation of the lenient policy he had adopted since Carthago Nova. The Iberians were released on the simple condition that they no longer take up arms against Rome, but with Scipio's aims running deeper than mercy. Before sending them home, he sent each group with messages for their chieftains across the upper Baetis Valley, an invitation to assemble at Baecula in 10 days' time, to take part in a council wherein the future of Hispania would be decided. And although no such terms nor clemency was extended to the North African prisoners, Scipio did make one rather important exception. Livy telling us of a young man, richly dressed, clearly noble, who was sent to Scipio. When Scipio questioned who he was, Livy recounts the young man's words. He said he was a Numidian, that his people called him Massiva, and that he had crossed into Spain with his uncle Massinissa, who had come with his cavalry to assist the Carthaginians. Undoubtedly, this was a stroke of pure fortune, and Scipio seized it instantly. Rather than consign the young man to slavery, he honored him, ensured his safety, and sent him back to Massinissa under a Roman escort, bearing gifts as well. Sparking the question, was Scipio already trying to win Massinissa over? Most definitely. The Numidians were among the finest cavalry in the Mediterranean, and Scipio knew their value. And although no alliance came from this gesture, not yet at least, Scipio had planted a seed, a quiet signal to Massinissa that Rome, not Carthage, might be a better partner in the future. And despite the fact that Massinissa would become an even greater thorn in the Roman side through the next years of the war for Hispania, what Scipio had initiated here was a vital relationship that would later be of immense help to finally hand Hannibal a battlefield defeat and bring the Second Punic War to an end in its entirety. A notion also strongly attributed to another crucial move Scipio made, not described directly by ancient writers, but unmistakable from their implications, in that both Polybius and Livy later reference Castulo as being firmly in Roman hands, which likely means one thing. Scipio must have seized the nearby town almost immediately after the battle, not by storming its walls, but almost certainly by surrender. The shock of Baecula, the annihilation of Hasdrubal's army, and Scipio's sudden rise in prestige would have sent ripples across every stronghold in the region. For the people of Castulo, they too saw which way the wind was blowing, with Scipio obtaining their submission before promptly fortifying the city, placing one of his top officers, Marcus Silanus, in command. In short order, Castulo would become a key operational anchor, housing an 11,000-strong detachment under Silanus, through which the Punic influence in south-central Hispania would remain irrevocably broken. Obviously, a huge benefit, but arguably not the greatest prize the town would yield, being that, as you may recall, Castulo controlled access to the rich silver mines of the region, the financial lifeblood of Carthage's operations in Spain. With the town now under Roman control, those veins of silver were completely severed. And while Rome wouldn't immediately exploit the mines at any meaningful capacity, that would take time. The loss to Carthage was instantaneous and catastrophic. As Patrick Hunt stresses in his book, Hannibal, without those mines, there would be no more revenue from most of Spain, severely diminishing overall Punic revenue. The funds produced by Carthage itself would be inconsequential in comparison. Carthage still possessed enormous financial reserves, but there was no way to replenish them now. Their war machine largely ran on Spanish silver, and Scipio had shut the tap completely. This was one of the most strategically devastating blows dealt to the Punic Empire in the entire war. A slow strangling of their finances, which would hamper them all the way to the bitter end. Leading us to the final major event that occurred shortly after Baecula, when, as covered in the episode's opening story, roughly 10 days after the battle, with news of the Carthaginian defeat quickly spreading across the Upper Baetis, tribal chieftains from the surrounding region gathered at Scipio's new encampment atop the plateau, where the Roman commander planned to leverage the shock of his victory, transforming it into a larger political movement. We can imagine that the plateau must have been an intimidating sight to those climbing up to its heights. Roman standards rippling in the wind, the rebuilt Carthaginian camp now firmly in Roman hands, the legions drawn up in strict formation. It was a deliberate display, a demonstration of Roman power. And Scipio stepped into this moment with the confidence of a man guided by forces beyond the mortal realm. His victory at Baecula was additional proof of his divine favor, and he made sure the Iberians understood it as such. But when he spoke to the gathering of Hispanian nobility, it was with measured respect, reinforcing the fundamental message he had used earlier with any new chieftain he had come into contact with, one of liberation, insisting that Rome's cause and theirs were one and the same, the expulsion of Carthage from their peninsula, which, according to Livy, was when the crowd of Spaniards flocked around him with great fervor, hailing him as king. Thereupon, Scipio, after silence had been secured, said that the highest title he would accept was that of Imperator, which that his soldiers had addressed him as, and the only title he would accept henceforth. The title of king was not to be endured in Rome, but if they believed him to have the spirit of a king, let it be their silent verdict. The assembly is said to have erupted in admiration. New alliances were enthusiastically affirmed, with more tribes pledging both logistical and military support to the cause. And the meeting ending with Scipio not as a crowned ruler, but as the uncontested general of an increasingly powerful anti-Carthaginian coalition. And although sources don't list which tribes joined him, given the geography, subgroups of the Oretani and Bastetani dominant in the Upper Baetis were almost certainly among them. Not all immediately vaulted to the Roman side, since Scipio would spend the rest of 208 and much of 207 consolidating his hold over the rest of the region. But the momentum was unmistakable. Baecula had indeed shifted the political landscape on a seismic scale. Yet, all of this coming with a considerable share of controversy back home, because while Polybius heaps lavish praise upon Scipio for refusing the title of king, calling it proof of his loyalty to the Republic, the later reaction among the Roman Senate was far less charitable. For them, any association with kingship was disdained, the aristocratic class viewing it as the most dangerous of ambitions, a veritable threat to the res publica. And as Anthony Everett notes in his book, The Rise of Rome, many senators were uneasy, even alarmed, because even if Scipio refused the title aloud, the Iberians were still treating him as a king, and he allowed it. It was, to some in Rome, yet another example of Scipio bending tradition, placing himself above normal constitutional limits, a pattern they found deeply troubling. How ambitious was this man? How far might he go? He had already sidestepped the rules twice, first in winning the aedileship, then, more overtly, maneuvering around the Senate to secure the Spanish command. And now he commanded an army that adored him, and an Iberian population that hailed him as a monarch. Concerns that would only grow louder in the months ahead, mixing in and adding to the scathing criticism over the choice Scipio would make next. A choice forced by the three Carthaginian commanders, Hasdrubal Barca, Mago Barca, and Hasdrubal Gisgo, who together, upon concluding their impromptu meeting somewhere just a few days north of Baecula, as Philip Freeman explains in his book Hannibal, they realized that not only was their future in Spain hanging precariously in the balance, but also Hannibal's campaign in Italy as well. Attempting an immediate counterattack on Scipio's army, so well entrenched in a perfect defensive position atop Baecula's plateau, was simply too risky, understanding that a second defeat might doom Carthage's war effort in both theaters. Accordingly, Howard Scullard outlines the plan they instead settled on. Mago would transfer about 8,000 men to Hasdrubal Barca, bringing his force to roughly 20,000, leaving Spain, marching for Italy, planning to hire additional mercenaries along the way. At last, bringing Hannibal the reinforcements they had postponed for far too long. Mago and Hasdrubal Gisgo, avoiding battle with Scipio, would focus on rebuilding. Mago falling back to Gades to await reinforcements from Africa, and Gisgo withdrawing west to raise new troops. And lastly, Massinissa would be given expanded authority over 7,000 cavalry with which to ravage the countryside, harassing Roman detachments, intimidating wavering tribes, and buying Carthage time. Belying their strategy, that was simple but bold. Send Hasdrubal to Italy to draw Scipio away, while Massinissa drained Roman strength, and Mago and Gisgo rebuilt a Punic army capable of reconquering Spain. And by mid-May 208 BC, Around the same time Scipio held that assembly with the Iberian chieftains, the Punic plan was set into motion. Mago headed southwest, Gisgo moved west, and Hasdrubal Barca began his long march northward, toward central Spain and ultimately toward Italy. Scipio's scouts reportedly tracked all of this closely, and although he couldn't have known every detail, he must have strongly suspected Hasdrubal's intention. And here, the Roman general faced a monumentally difficult decision: chase Hasdrubal north, attempting to intercept and prevent him from ever reaching Italy, or remain in southern Spain, further consolidating his stunning victory, locking down more alliances, tightening the Roman grip over the peninsula. Scipio chose the latter. Once again, he refused to pursue Hasdrubal, and this decision, coupled with the news that the Iberian chieftains had hailed him as a king, ignited a political firestorm in Rome. To men like Fabius Maximus, the Delayer, and the rest of the Old Guard, in control of the Senate in every which way but name, this wasn't strategy, this was negligence, even dereliction. Protecting Italy, and thus Rome, was everything. All else was secondary. But Scipio remained unmoved. He would not abandon Hispania. Not now. Not when the whole of the region was poised to fall into his hands. If he raced north, the entire political and military structure he had built, from northeastern Hispania to Carthago Nova, extending now to Baecula, could unravel. This was his theater. Here he held Imperium, and would allow nothing to divert him from his ultimate aim: the complete destruction of Carthaginian power in Hispania. In the next episode, we'll follow Scipio through the rest of 208 BC as he pushes to secure full Roman control over the Upper Baetis. Some tribes bending to diplomacy, others requiring force, as the war for Hispania shifts into a grinding contest of attrition, with Massinissa and his cavalry waging a devastating guerrilla campaign, harassing Scipio at every turn. Meanwhile, Hasdrubal Barca departs Spain for Italy, and once again, Scipio refuses to abandon Hispania to pursue him, a decision that reignites fury in the Senate, especially given the looming danger of two Barca brothers and their armies operating in Italy at the same time, giving us the perfect moment to jump back to Italy and catch up on everything that's happened since Scipio left. Hannibal still dangerous, but confined to a shrinking pocket in the south. This, as Hasdrubal enters the theater, leading to the Battle of the Metaurus in 207 BC. And despite the senatorial Old Guard denouncing Scipio for letting Hasdrubal escape, his stunning successes in Spain, along with growing support among the Roman masses, and even among some in the Senate, prove enough to keep him in command. Which will then return us to the events in Hispania through 207 BC. Massinnissa's continuing raids, Scipio's expanding grip over the peninsula, and a daring raid by Scipio's officer, Silanus, that further cripples Carthaginian strength, all building toward the final showdown for control of Spain, the last great clash between Rome and Carthage on Iberian soil. This and more to come in the next episode of the Warlords of History podcast. And in the meanwhile, if you want to support the podcast, there are many ways you can help. You can tell your family and friends about the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you happen to access the show on. You can follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And lastly, you can head on over to the show's website, warlordsofhistory.com, where on the support section of the site, you can find the show's Patreon or PayPal links in the event that you want to contribute to the podcast directly. But beyond this, where I'll also include some additional info, like images and maps pertaining to this episode for your viewing pleasure, and where you can also reach out to me with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Theme music from audionautics.com.